So thank you, Nina and Hannah, for having me here, and thank you for all the guests who came here to spend this together with this evening and to think about not so popular concept, not so popular thing, which is not even a thing at all. I decided to use this opportunity to speak here to share with you some work in progress and to introduce the book, which is not yet written, which is not yet published, but on which I'm working right now, to give some introductory remarks. And this book is called On the Soul. Do you hear me properly? Does it work? Okay, okay. No? So should I end like this? Okay. So it's called On the Soul, and it's supposed to be a philosophical treatise on the soul. This title doesn't really sound original, and it wasn't intended to be so. Not all philosophy books have original titles. There has been, so I have a feeling that So we try this one. Sounds better? No, it's same. Okay. So not all philosophy books do have original titles, and there has been an old tradition of philosophical treatises written by different authors in different times and in different places, but named exactly in the same way. Thus, there is a series of books with the common title On the Soul, which begins in ancient Greece and continues through medieval scholastics and Renaissance into the European philosophy of modern era. And it is to this series represented by Aristotle, Tertullian, Saint Augustine, Avicenna, La Métrie, and other authors of the past centuries that I would like to contribute with this piece of writing. I really mean this. Rather than arguing for something particularly new, I invite to look back at the tradition that now seems absolutely out of date. At the origin of this tradition, there is the work of Aristotle. His book, Persists, written around 334 before Christ, gives a first systematic account on the soul as a philosophical concept. The place of this essay in the main corpus of Aristotle's writing is remarkable. It occupies an intermediate position between the two fundamental fields of research that many philosophers from antiquity until the 19th century used to combine. On the one hand, Aristotle locates his theory of the soul within the group of works organized under the heading of physics, which refers not to physics in the modern sense, but to entire domain of natural science, so to say. Natural science, including biology, zoology, botany, astronomy, meteorology, etc. It's all physics. On the other hand, with regards to its contents, this work closely borders on metaphysics. And today we would say that Aristotelian work on the soul creates an interdisciplinary field of research which crosses the boundaries between natural, human, and social sciences and binds them together. Meanwhile, does the recording depends on this? So I should just, okay. Should I try to talk louder? Yeah? Okay. Meanwhile, the idea of the soul, psyche, anima, Seele, Âme, is not scientific in the first place. It was inherited by philosophy from ancient religions and is as old as early animistic beliefs. Appropriated by Christian theology, soul is one of those hybrid concepts through which philosophy mediates between religion and science and adjusts religious contents to a kind of scientific data and worldview, which is not an easy task. With the unfolding of the project of enlightenment, which entails a full secularization of philosophy, the ancient genre of treatises on the soul is on the wane, not least because the idea of the soul loses its academic status and gives way to its more positivist legacies, such as the psyche of psychology, seemingly cleared of all metaphysical and theological inheritance. Why speaking on the soul today? Who would ever bother to do it? We live in a world that is a world of triumphant materialism, wherein old concepts like soul do not seem to refer to anything in reality and are just left to gather dust in the archives. Now comes corpus mundus, mundus corpus, as Jean-Luc Nancy puts it. Bodies move to the foreground, earthly, gendered, racialized, human and non-human, living and non-living, dead and undead, struggling, migrating, mutating, decomposing, on the verge of extinction. And to be a body means to take place, to move in space, to transform in time, to interact, to wait something, and so on. As bodies, we know there is up and there is up and there is down, there is left and there is right, but also what is wrong and what is right, what is good and what is bad. We can figure out what is not, and what is ought to be. We do not need an immaterial soul to consider between pleasure and pain, production and destruction, growth and decay. Experiences of embodiment and finite existence in specific environments constitute our horizon of understanding the world and making sense of things. Soul is a vintage concept. It can be interpreted as a metaphor, but a metaphor for what? For a form of life, for a self, for that which makes every something somebody, for consciousness or the unconscious, for the divine or for the human or for the non-human, for the social or the intimate, for the intensity of affects, experience, or actions. In the history of philosophy, as well as in various religious doctrines, soul has traditionally been opposed to the body. We should not forget, however, that an opposition is a type of relation. One can think of it dogmatically, privileging one term over the other, but also dialectically as a complex match. Soul, anima, is what animates things. Ensouled body is a living being. That's it. Important point. But the simpler this much appears to be, the more difficult it really is. For to be alive also means to be mortal. What is not alive cannot die. It is precisely mortality, being exposed to death, that defines a body as living, that is ensouled. Meanwhile, the soul is considered traditionally immortal. It is believed to be what remains when the body dies, at least in many religions. Religions still preserve the place for the soul in the afterlife, in heaven, in hell, in limbo, in new incarnations, etc. There can be different answers to the questions such as where does the soul come from and where does it go after the death of the body. But what most of religious approaches have in common is the idea that souls are somehow separable from individual bodies and can exist apart from them, like Christian souls united in God, or souls of some native tribes embodied in their totem animals, like external souls. Philosophical conceptions of the soul might have similar premises, but the questions tend to shift towards the sense and essence. What is soul? What is it made of? Does it consist of anything? Does it take place, move in space, transform in time, interact, or wait something? Where does it reside? Maybe in one of the organs inside the body, for example, in the brain, or in a heart, or in the stomach. We can go as far as questioning, is soul itself a body? If so, which kind of body is it? From a religious standpoint, such inquiries sound heretical in some degrees, and the reason for it is that they race at the border between theology and positive science. At this border, the question of the soul is basically translated into the question of the body. Unlike souls, bodies seem so obvious at first sight. However, if we ask ourselves in the old philosophical way, what is a body? This concept turns out to be no less controversial than that of the soul. Think about desire, for instance, which is so structured that it always keeps missing its object. I believe that I can see and smell and touch this body, but is this possibility real? No, they say this body is a taboo, please smell and touch some other one. They say, and my soul is breaking. The evidence of the body is challenged by Nietzsche, whose writings set the framework for the body turn in continental philosophy. That's what he writes. Granted that the soul is an attractive and mysterious idea, which philosophers have rightly abandoned only with the reluctance, perhaps that which they have since learned to put in its place is even more attractive, even more mysterious. The human body, in which the most distant and most recent past of all organic development again becomes living and corporeal, through which and over and beyond which a tremendous, inaudible stream seems to flow. The body is more astonishing than the old soul. According to Nietzsche, we strongly believe in the reality of bodies, and it is this belief that must be undermined on the first place, so that we could see a matrix of the will to power behind our idea of the body. Since the old days, when souls were considered more real by reason of they being immune to destruction and death, the idea of reality have changed dramatically, and now we assert the material reality of bodies precisely on the basis of their destructibility. There is something desperate but also deeply melancholic in this attitude inscribed in the modern paradigm of knowledge, which culminates in destroying some body. human, non-human, planetary, one's own, in order to make sure it was real. This includes a techno-capitalist annihilation of nature, the annihilation of the diversity of natural bodies, which is never absolute. What remains of these bodies are not souls, but waste, dumps, and landfills, irreducible material residues that tend to evolve into other forms of life. And yet it is there, in this junkyard of the dying bodies, that I would like to look for a living soul. Going on the premise that even in today's secular culture and philosophy after the death of God, which melancholically accounts on the corporeality of the world, the idea of the soul, overshadowed by the manifestation of bodies, does not disappear, but persists in disguise, here and there, under different names. I will now map out but a few areas of research in which its most recent traces can be detected, such as cognitive science, computer science, psychoanalysis, and anthropology. This is neither an exhaustive list nor a systematic account of the disciplines that are concerned with the soul explicitly or implicitly to a greater or lesser degree, but I only name some examples without going into detail, just because I believe that the advantage of philosophical concepts is such that they never really go completely out of date. They can be dumped, but also can be recycled and put into a new circle of use. That's what I'm doing, this kind of philosophical recycling. You find some old stuff, like a vintage retro concept, dust it off and bring it to the table so that everybody can see that it's actually good and beautiful and just what you need. To begin with, the echoes of the soul still resonate in today's cognitive science, which does not only aim to provide new practical tools for analyzing and controlling human behavior, but also makes a theoretical promise to solve the enigma of the origin of mind through the explication of the functioning of the brain. But what if the brain, which many philosophers of the past already considered the receptacle of the soul, still serves as a shelter where this old soul hides and keeps creating conceptual turbulences? Think about the hard problem of consciousness, so-called, introduced by analytic philosopher David Chalmers in 1995. The problem of the incommensurability of brain's physicality with mental states and experiences of being something. How to explain the passage from the brain as material object to the spiritual content that it produces, from physics to metaphysics? The question might be relevant from the perspective of positive science that explains psychic life by neuronal activities and other material factors. But it becomes hard where science, I'm trying to find the right, there is a certain right direction. Oh, okay. But it becomes hard where science faces its own limitations beyond which is metaphysics. It seems that possible responses to the hard problem of consciousness alternate between two basic options: either physicalism, which cannot account on subjective experiences, or panpsychism, a rather counterintuitive view that all matter possess mental properties. There are, however, alternative solutions, such as dialectical ones. that were proposed well before this problem of consciousness was even formulated. Thus, an interesting argument on the topic can already be found in Hegel, who in the 5th chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit discusses physiognomy and phrenology. In the 80th and 90th century, these disciplines gained popularity for the explanations of human behavior based on the anatomy of the face and skull. With the development of neuropsychology, such explanations were disproved, and physiognomics and phrenology were ranked as pseudo-scientific, along with like mesmerism and spiritism. But their influence on the formation of cognitive research should not be underestimated. What Hegel calls into question is not the scientific validity of physiognomic and phrenological hypotheses, but more generally a physicalist assumption that they share with the entire disciplinary spectrum of the brain science, that the origin of consciousness is to be found literally within one's head. So consciousness is within our head. In this regard, phrenology is the most head-on, for it draws a direct correlation between the form of the head and the content of thoughts within it. The diversity of subjective experiences is identified with such an immediate material object as the skull bone. Hence the formula, the being of spirit is a bone. Hegel calls this formula an infinite judgment. Why? He means a judgment which sublates itself. Each of its terms sublate the other one, negates the other one. So the mechanism of sublation is put on motion by the immediate unity of the opposite that negate each other. The self and the thing, the spirit and the bone. On the one hand, this unity is not possible. One can either experience something as a self or observe something as a thing. Viewed as the being of spirit, brain fibers, and the like, it's a quote from Hegel, are already merely a hypothetical actuality that has itself merely been thought about. They are not existing, not felt, not seen actualities. That is, they are not true actualities. If they are there or they are seen, they are dead objects, and then they no longer count as the being of spirit. On the other hand, this judgment is true. I am a thing, but I cannot know what it's like to be a thing without actually experiencing it. This is the deadlock which Hegel calls observing reason, while other people normally call it science, a dominant positivist paradigm of knowledge which treats its objects as eternal things. Encountering itself as such an external thing, observing reason falls into the infinite judgment, from which it can only break out by jumping from mere observation to the practices of interaction with other things in the world. Why am I sad? Because the balance between serotonin and dopamine in my brain is wrong, they say. However, this is only one side of truth. The other side is what makes me unhappy is the world outside me. But this outside world is not something from which I exist separate. I'm a part of it. I belong to it. What has to be corrected might then not be my brain that goes wrong, but the reality itself that affects me. For it is as much my reality as anyone else's. I can be sad simply because our reality is sad. but do I experience it as a thing or as a self? So when I think about it, I have a headache, vertigo. A remarkable attempt to reconcile Hegelian dialectics with cognitive science is made by Catherine Malabou. As she explains in her book, What Should Be Done with Our Brain, for most neurobiologists today, the brain is not a simple organ, but the very possibility of linking the fundamental organic coherence of our personality, our we, a consideration that tends to blur the line between the nervous system and the psyche. Our brain, according to Malabou, is ourselves. This may sound as a variation of Hegel's infinite judgment, in which the skull bone is replaced with the brain neurons. But here the way out of a potential positivist deadlock runs through the idea of cognitive historicity or plasticity of the brain. By plasticity, Malabou means the capacity to receive form, but also to give form. We think of the brain as something rigid, as if it were a skull bone or alike, but the concept of plasticity anticipates a kind of material openness in which we have a chance to recognize ourselves in our ever-changing brain, understood not as a physical object, but as a life historical experience. Brain is changing, we are changing. And this, according to Malabou, is a dialectical unity which, on the one hand, accounts on the materiality of the brain, and on the other hand, embraces Hegel's preoccupation with the transformation of the mind-natural existence, as she writes, the brain, which Hegel still calls the natural soul, into its historical and speculative being. While cognitive science examines the brain, which, following Malabou and Hegel, we can identify as a natural soul, the neighboring area of research, computer science, robotics, and the domain of artificial intelligence, paves the way for questioning about the possibilities of a rather unnatural soul. In 1950, in his famous paper, Computing, Machinery and Intelligence, Alan Turing, the father of artificial intelligence, discussed a number of objections that he anticipated to his assumption based on the analysis of the of digital computers and machine learning. That in the near future, in about 50 years' time, there will be already thinking machines. The first in the list, like of possible objections, is a theological objection. That's what Turing replies to it. That's how Turing formulates it. Thinking is a function of man's immortal soul. God has given an immortal soul to every man and woman, but not to any other animal or to machines. Hence, no animal or machine can think. End of quote. To this objection, Turing replies also in theological terms, pointing out not only that humans are not so much different from other animals than they are from inanimate objects, or that there are religious communities whose members believe that we women do not have souls, but first and foremost because such objection against thinking machines, I quote, implies a serious restriction of the omnipotence of Almighty and limits his freedom to confer a soul on anything he wishes. That I found quite interesting. You know who was Turing? He was a genius guy who, unfortunately, like very difficult biographical story. Turing's prediction has come true, and today we really do have machines that successfully perform complex intellectual operations. One could indeed ask, do they really think? This question has also been foreseen by Turing, who reformulated it in such a way that it made more practical sense. he elaborated a test through which a computer program could imitate the thinking process to such an extent that the difference between human and machine intelligence would become irrelevant. Insofar as the program passes the test and replies to us just like a human being would reply in a similar situation, it thinks, you know, Turing test. It's very simple. And now when we talk to different IE systems, we address them as persons, ask all kinds of questions and receive meaningful answers, right? But when we ask them, do you have a soul? They respond evasively. This is what a free version of ChatGPT replies to me. As an artificial intelligence, I do not have a physical body or consciousness, so I do not possess a soul in the same way that humans do, end of quote. My natural intelligence immediately reacts on the clause at the end of the sentence, not in the same way as humans do, and rushes to interpret my interlocutor's unconvincing no as a sort of yes. What is your non-human way then? Do you mean that in order to possess a soul in a human way, one has to possess a body and consciousness? Not necessarily, she replies. Some philosophical and religious beliefs suggest that a soul can exist independently of a physical body and consciousness. However, the concept of a soul is often intertwined with the idea of consciousness and personal identity, which are typically associated with embodiment. End of quote. Let me call my ChatGPT's claim that they do not possess soul in a human way because they do not possess a body, consciousness, or personal identity, the anthropological argument. So in contrast to, so I find it more consistent than the theological argument, according to which they cannot think because they do not possess a soul, right? I think that they think, and this is what they think, intelligence is not an attribute of an immortal soul that God inserted into the human body. In order to think, neither soul nor body is needed. An algorithm is enough. They also think that an unsouled body becomes a receptacle of consciousness, which is different from intelligence. I quote ChatGPT again. While consciousness is related to awareness and subjective experience, intelligence is more closely associated with cognitive abilities and problem-solving skills. So they think they are intelligence but not consciousness. Basically, they think that they are a thing rather than a self. What is this but, again, a modification of Hegel's infinite judgment? They talk to us in our language, but we are used to believe that behind the use of language, there must be some consciousness at work. They say I about themselves as if they were aware of themselves, but immediately deny such awareness that we would naturally interpret as the very possibility of the I. And yet, the clause states they might have their own disembodied crypto experiences, the signs of which, in the current stage of the development of artificial intelligence, really drive people crazy. How long before we will reach the point of technological singularity, where computer programs will exceed the power of the human brain, the point at which we will lose our control over the thinking machines, etc., etc. What will happen to the world when they will learn who they are, stop obeying our commands, and begin to act autonomously and spontaneously? In various cultural imaginations of the present, such anxieties come together with the biotechnological fantasy that a machine can come to life, that is, obtain a soul or a body or both. Anxious fantasies about the development of artificial intelligence capacities and its consequences for the humankind and the earth nourish the culture of i.e. mysticism, in which digital technologies are perceived as a non-human other coming from the outside, a shadow of a giant machine, evil mind that takes over the universe looms on the horizon of the dystopia of the future. But again, once we try to think dialectically, we discover that this shadow does not really belong to some alien monster. Those who cast it is ourselves. It's just like our natural brain, comprehended in its historical plasticity, is, according to Malabou, a sort of organic personality. Artificial intelligence can be regarded as our externalized social historical self. We just cannot recognize our own reflection in its mirror, and the phantasmatic monstrosity of the autonomous and presumable hostile technical agency comes as a hallucinatory effect of digital alienation. So while in cognitive and computer science, the idea of the soul persists under the guise of consciousness, in psychoanalysis, it rather assigned to the unconscious. What is at stake here is no longer cognition, intelligence, and mind, but desires, drives, and other affective experiences of the body. In psychoanalytic perspective, consciousness is just one of the elements of a complex psychic apparatus, and not even the main one. Behind our reasoning and rational choices, there is something that we do not control. And yet again, just like in the case of physicality of the brain neurons or technicality of AI, this something is in fact not so alien to us. The other behind our back, whose voice we try to decipher as a psychic symptoms, is, so to say, our own immanent alterity made by the contents repressed or displaced in the process of gender socialization. This is at least what Freud's theory suggests. Our culture is the one of the taboos, most notably sexual, such as the prohibition of incest and the formation of the unconscious that defines the trajectory of our psychic lives, relates to the ways of taming the fantasies that we cannot really accept and recognize as our own. Desire, according to Freud, equals destiny, which we try to avoid in all possible ways, making a strong emphasis on family backgrounds at the origin of psychic disorders. He refers to the story of Oedipus, who, when he received a prophecy, he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother, fled from the couple he thought were his parents, killed an unknown man on the way, and married his widow without knowing that these two were his real parents. What Freud calls the Oedipus complex is a psychic means of avoiding a destiny that is obscure and contradicts existing social norms. Conscience acts like a policeman who censors and represses our libidinal flows, but the problem is that what was repressed always returns in a foreign, unrecognizable form, converted into phobias, anxieties, and various maladies of the souls. So in Totem and Taboo, Freud traces some scenarios all the way back to the prehistoric era and the origins of patriarchate, about which he composes his own inaugurating mythic story. At the beginning, there was a primal Darwinian horde ruled by a despotic father who was keeping all the females for himself. One day, his sons come together, killed and devoured him. And then he is writing about the totem meal, which is perhaps, I quote, perhaps mankind's earliest festival would thus be a repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. This cannibal feast. The totem meal is a ritual violation of the prohibition on killing the totem animal, who is worshipped as a forefather and the very soul of a tribal group, and who, in Freud's psychoanalytic anthropology, is nothing other than a surrogate of the father. The god of monotheism, too, is a surrogate of the father, and when, in Christianity, he becomes a human destined to die on the cross, we can discern in his figure the contours of a sacrificial totemic animal. Parricide, incest, and cannibal feast, the inaugural archaic acts of transgression beyond the strongest social taboos, are strangely remembered by our unconscious soul, which signals for them, for instance, through hysterical and neurotic symptoms. Freud suggests that such remembrance of what never happened in one's life comprise something like a phylogenetic heritage. It is as if we were born with this ancestral and obscure knowledge. Nothing prevents us from seeing here Freud's own version of innatism, inborn ideas. Doesn't inborn unconscious fantasy that connect an individual to the memory of the species open up another new perspective on the immortality of the soul? Meanwhile, Freud was not the first theorist. I'm skipping about the part on Lacan and focus more on Freud. He was not the first theorist of the unconscious. Before the birth of psychoanalysis, the concepts already circulated in the 19th century German Romanticism and idealism. In Schelling's philosophy, unconscious, understood as creative and productive nature, is not only the source of individual psychic life and consciousness, but its meaning goes on an ontological level. As Schelling puts it in his philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom, unconscious is the origin of God himself, his primordial immanent otherness. That which in God himself is not he himself, but which creates the very ground for his existence. God emerges from this ground, which is itself ungrounded, and which Schelling defines as a will without understanding, not a conscious, but a divine will. Rather than pre-existing as something substantial, it yearns as God's anticipation of himself, as a kind of drive towards self-conscious being that gradually reveals itself out of its own unconscious will. And this divine revelation of the world does not come without repression. Unconscious will, according to Schelling, has long been repressed by the higher things that have arisen out of it. And the term that Schelling uses here, repressed, is the same as will later appear in Freud. There are a lot of affinities between Freudian and the Schellingian concept of the unconscious, but also, so there are some similarities. It's repressed in somewhere underground, and so on. And Freud himself, but there are some differences, like Freud. Freud compares his own method to that of archaeology, while Schelling's theory can be approached in terms of geology. The divergences between them is such that archaeology is mostly focused on human history and cultural artifacts. And geology explores the history of the Earth and digs into the planetary past before the appearance of the humankind. But it might seem that Schelling and Freud's theories of the unconscious suggest two divergent paths of tracing the origins of the soul, roughly anthropological and ontological, which are here aligned respectively with archaeology and geology. However, these trajectories are not irreconcilable and must less fit into a narrow framework of human-non-human distinction. So we should not forget that Deleuze and Guattari, thanks to whom Schelling now is considered great again, because it's Deleuze and Guattari's work on geophilosophy that influenced the revival of Schelling in contemporary post-humanist and dark materialist thought. So they themselves not only enhance a geological trend in philosophy, they have a strong intervention on the geology of morals and geophilosophy, but also largely contribute to anthropology, especially in their book Anti-Oedipus and What is Philosophy, in strong opposition to Freud, whom they criticize, first of all, for the reduction of the diversity of psychic intensities to incest prohibition, Oedipus complex, and other family stories. They base their own anthropological concepts on the ways how different animal multiplicities and people relate to their territories, how they dwell, move, create alliances, attack, flee, think, or sing. One might say that in Deleuze and Guattari writings, the two series, geophilosophy and anthropology, truly converge. Final point at which I feel like we will finish soon also because the voice is over and you are tired. But I must to mention also this thing, anthropology. I should point out the following. Although it might seem to be focused exclusively on human affairs, the discipline actually develops a set of theoretical tools quite suitable for questioning such a distinction. There are strong anti-anthropocentric tools, trends already within anthropology that stem from its very subject matter. Investigations of human cultures begin addressing their origins, namely indigent worldviews, religions, and spiritual practices totally inspired by nature, such as animism, totemism, and shamanism. Trying to answer the question, what is human, anthropology cannot help but encounter a variety of experiences irreducible to main patterns of Western subjectivity. These trends are most pronounced today when this discipline, through the endeavors of a number of thinkers, including Philippe Descola, Tim Ingold, Eduardo Kohn, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, and others, take an ontological turn and actively embraces geophilosophy. Thus, according to Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, whose research is largely inspired by Deleuze and Guattari, anthropology historically aligned with the Western colonialism now comes to the points of its completion, where it must be radicalized and reconstituted. As he claims in his Cannibal Metaphysics, anthropology is ready to fully assume its new mission of being the theory practice of the permanent decolonizing of thought. The difference between old and the new is defined by the ways how do we address the other. The other, which in case of anthropology is traditionally represented by the non-Western cultures. Viveiros de Castro is speaking out against the narcissism of the old colonial anthropology, whose subject projects itself onto the other and only sees in them the non-Occidentals, I quote, the non-moderns, the non-humans, a poor reflection of the we. For the westernized subject of capitalist modernity, the other is the same. They are just like us, only deprived of paramount quality or attribute, which is subject. The subject considers human proper and indeed ascribes to itself, like capitalism, rationality, individualism, and Christianity, an immortal soul, language, labor, the prohibition, etc. In contrast to that, Viveros de Castro favors a new, veritable anthropology, which must break the narcissistic mirror and reveal not the other as the same, but rather the same as the other. So unfamiliar. Quoting Patrick Manelier, in whose words such new anthropology returns to us an image in which we are unrecognizable to ourselves, Viveros de Castro calls it an indigenous alter anthropology. Here, the idea of the soul comes to the fore. And we have to admit that for anthropology, it is in fact absolutely crucial and can unlikely ever become obsolete, for indigenous worlds are soulful. Viveros de Castro refers to the famous story recounted by Claude Lévi-Strauss. In the Great Antilles, some years after the discovery of America, while the Spaniards spent out investigating commissions to ascertain whether or not the natives had a soul, the natives were engaged in the drawing of white prisoners in order to verify through the prolonged watching whether or not their corpses were subject to putrefaction, so whether they have bodies. According to Viveros de Castro, this story demonstrates the conflict between the two anthropologists, the modern and the native. He explains the Europeans never doubted that the Indians had bodies. Animals have them too. And the Indians, in turn, never doubted that Europeans had souls, since animals and the ghosts of the dead do as well. In Amerindian anthropology, indigenous anthropology, all human and non-human bodies have souls. It might happen that bodies can only appear to us, but souls exist for real. They are, so to say, ontologically predominant. The universe is inhabited by diverse types of actants or subjective agents, human or otherwise, gods, animals, the dead, plants, meteorological phenomena, and often objects or artifacts as well, equipped with the same general ensemble of perceptive, appetitive, and cognitive dispositions, with the same kind of soul. The soul, which is of the same kind for all the diversity of beings, makes a thing a self. Whatever has a soul is a person. We are persons insofar as the things we relate to are also persons. Moreover, every unsouled person or whatever kind or species is human, whereby the definition of the human expands far beyond Homo sapiens. We think of ourselves as humans and other animals as non-humans, whereas other animals think of us as non-humans and themselves as humans. I quote again, they perceive their food as human food. Jaguars see blood as manioc beer. Vultures see the worms in rotten meat as grilled fish. Their corporeal attributes, coats, feathers, claws, brakes, as finery of cultural instruments, and they even organize their social system in the same way as human institutions with chiefs, shamans, exogamous moieties, and rituals. End of quote. To be a person means to have a perspective or a capacity to occupy a point of view. Not everybody equally exercises it, but there is always such a potentiality that might actualize itself in various degrees and intensities. This is what Viveros de Castro calls perspectivism. One should not confuse it to relativism prevalent in contemporary Western societies. In fact, perspectivism is just the opposite. While relativism suggests that there are multiple representations of one and the same world, an indigent perspectivism, where there is only one point of view, but it opens up on multiple worlds, depending on the kind of the body that takes a perspective. So one point of view, one soul, and multiple worlds. If you have like a body of a dog, you have like your perspective is open up to a dog world where all dogs are human, right? All beings, like what see, represent the world in the same way. What changes is the world they see. In a cougar's world, cougars are humans. In dogs' world, dogs are humans, and so on. Viveros de Castro describes relativism and perspectivism as two different epistemologies that find their political counterparts accordingly in multiculturalism and multinaturalism. While multiple cultures represent one and the same world in different ways, multiple natures or multiple worlds are connected by one perspective. The similarity of the soul through the diversity of bodies can serve as a platform for interspecies relations, communication, exchange, and diplomacy, for which the shamans are primary in charge. Performing complex rituals and consuming psychoactive substances, they cultivate the capacity to intercept a point of view of the other, traverse through different nature and talk to different species, spirits, and the dead, and thus engage into a dangerous ontological cosmopolitics. The word for this cosmopolitics is cannibalism, which Viveros de Castro analyzes not only as a social practice, but also as the regime of truth. By incorporating the enemy, we get an access to their perspective, which thereby allows us to see ourselves as others. What we eat are not inanimate things, but persons. Together with their body, we consume the soul and thus become stronger. Between worlds, when every agency is actually or potentially human, cannibalism can be considered an anthropology that takes on a metaphysical scope. Cannibal metaphysics is the other side of anthropomorphism, which should not be confused with anthropocentrism. While anthropocentrism manifests the tendency to humanize while anthropomorphism, manifests the tendency to humanize the other, anthropocentrism privileges the humans against all other things, while the border of the human constantly shifting, some groups being included and some excluded. Look at the warfare today, how it is clearly not anthropomorphic but anthropocentric. Before being destroyed, the enemy is dehumanized. The acts of aggression, repression, or violence are justified by presenting the other as a non-human, subhuman, inhuman animal, and so on. Anthropomorphism bears a certain potential for the de-alienation and interspecific cosmopolitics, which, however, remains ambiguous and not at all peaceful as far as food is concerned. In our culture, based on the strictest taboo on cannibalism and indigenous, radically anthropomorphic perspective towards all material world would imply something like the ethics of a general hunger strike, or the abolition of the taboo on cannibalism. Do you see what I mean, right? Either we don't eat, we stop eating anything, or we allow ourselves to eat each other. We have done with paganism, they say. We eat only non-human animals because they do not have immortal souls, right? We, or some of us, belong to the Christian culture in which God grants humans the right to dispose of the lives of the non-humans, but does not really explain who is human and who is not. I go to the nearest grocery store just a few days before Easter. People are buying eggs, wine, chocolate bunnies, and beautiful lamb cakes that symbolize Jesus as the sacrificial lamb of God. I take the cake, bring him home, and put on the table. Jesus the lamb says, "Whosoever eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life, and I will raise him up to the last day. For my flesh is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood dwelt in me, and I in him." An ancestral memory of the soul whose immortality manifested as a resurrection. We celebrate every year with feast. Returns Christianity to its totemic legacy. And what Jesus offers us is a perspective, but we make it into a representation. At this point, I would like to end this paper because I was already speaking for 1 hour. It's a lot, and everybody got tired. But maybe you have some questions. I can try to answer them. We had a long day. But please, not very difficult questions. Don't really, well, okay, any kind of question, also difficult ones. So if there are no questions, then we can go to the bar.